Tom Cooper, who's a part of the Faculty of Business. So Tom, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to everyone for attending. There's some people here I know, like the amazing Allison McNeil, who thinks deep thoughts about all this kind of stuff all the time, and a number of names I kind of recognize. So thank you so much for listening to me speak about what I kind of classify as kind of a happy accident, which is the use of TED Talks as a tool for reflective learning in a remote environment. And I'm going to be, how shall I put this? I'm not going to be super academic on this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the academic theory and some of the implications. I got some great quotes from students about the use of this, and very happy to discuss how you could use this both for your own personal learning, as well as using it in a classroom as well. Okay. Oops. So the first time I heard about a TED Talk was probably 2010, 2009. One of my MBA students was organizing a local chapter of it, and he decided, instead of spending all his money on going to a very expensive US MBA program, he was just going to go around and go to all the go to the TED Talks and network from there. And it was a very good investment. Actually, he's a very successful guy right now, and he said, yeah, that was the right thing to do. And what TED Talks are, and you can go online, they have a great website, is they're recorded events where individual speakers get up, and this is using their words, not mine, offer us an authentic listening where many hundreds of amazing TED speakers make their ideas worth sharing. And the really cool thing about TED Talks is about the spectrum of people who are willing to get up and talk about something they're very interested in, or very passionate about it, or have an element of expertise. And there's specific rules, like, you can't. It used to be that you weren't allowed to use PowerPoint slides, or now I think you use a couple, but you can only speak for 20 minutes or so. So there is very specific rules. None of them I've never seen a TED Talk go longer than maybe 20 minutes, but there is specific rules in terms of what they expect. And I would classify them as semi-academic. There's a lot of people talking about specific research questions, but they are very influential. And from a teaching and learning perspective, they cover education, business, science, medicine, technology, sports, art, culture, so many different fields. And I'll come back to, there's almost a TED Talk for anything that you're trying to develop. Okay. So when I was starting to prepare this talk and I'm going through the literature, there was a gap, which is always a great thing for someone who's interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning, when you figure, oh, there's a gap in the literature. But most of the academic literature that talks about TED Talks uses them in terms of how do you improve listening skills, especially for English as a second language student and others. So in this presentation, I'm going to specifically talk about the role of TED Talks in promoting reflective thinking in specifically business and management students. I would argue, in terms of generalizability, that this probably has some wider implications pretty much in all the different university disciplines, probably a little bit maybe more professional schools, but especially as a kind of maybe as an icebreaker, thought provoker, more getting people to talk. I'll talk about why that is, and how I was able to use them. But ultimately, this is the focus of the sample. The students I'll be talking about was in business and management. So just a little bit of background to TED. So TED is a not-for-profit, and it's devoted to spreading ideas, usually in the form of short, powerful talks. So as I mentioned before, 18 minutes or less. So you're kind of saying, why do they call them TED Talks? Well, when it was started as a conference in 1984, it was where technology, entertainment, and design, so that's where it is, it's an acronym, converged. And today covers off almost all topics from science to business to global issues in more than 100 languages. And it's really interesting to see the development of TED Talks, especially in relation to parts of the world, like in terms of there's a big one of them in Hindi, there's in Russian, there's so many different languages around that you can use it from there. Also in terms of, so when they started off, there was these kind of bigger global TED events, and now you see local ones called TEDx, and they're independently run. So they're not run by the major TED organization, which is a not-for-profit. For example, there's a local St. John's TEDx event, and those recordings are, those talks are recorded and then they're put online, etc. So it's very much about sharing ideas in communities around the world. As I mentioned, started in 1984, and there was a gentleman by the name of Richard Saul Werman who tried to say, how do we start to converge these three ideas? The first TED, which was in 1984, as I mentioned, included a demo of the compact disc, big technology at the time, the ebook, and cutting-edge 3D graphics from Lucasfilm. While mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot demonstrated how to map coastlines using his developing theory of fractal geometry. Problem was, they didn't make any money. They lost a lot of money the first time that they did it. And it wasn't run again until almost 6 years later in 1990. In 1990, it was started again. They had an annual conference, ran for about 10 years in Monterey, California. And then the not-for-profit Sapling Foundation acquired the rights to TED in 2001. I think it was Chris Christensen, I think is the gentleman's name, who's the head of that. But, you know, why would you say 2001? 2001 was .com era. There was a lot of money, especially in California. I would imagine that somebody made a lot of money off of a tech buyout and decided, hey, that's what we're going to do. And I think that's kind of the background. Since 2001, it's been crazy. So the first six TED Talks were posted online on June 27th, 2006, basically 6 months before I started at Memorial University. Within 6 months, they had 1 million views. This is early days of the internet. This is not just someone, you know, posting Gangnam Style or twerking or something like that on YouTube. These are six talks, and they were so popular that within a year, the website was relaunched around them, and those free access to the world's greatest thinkers, leaders, and teachers was put in place. In the fall of 2012, 1 billionth video view was accomplished by TED, which, you know, in terms of getting this talk, I didn't know that before I started looking into this, so that was wild. And they have an average of 17 new page views a second, and TED conference, this is using their language, TED conferences and events continue to inspire, motivate, and thrill attendees. If anyone's ever gone to one of these, they are phenomenal, and there are a lot of interest. So why are we talking about TED Talks? So back in 2019, I was on sabbatical. And the big project I was working on, which was with the international program, we were working with the Jamaican government. And the Jamaican government had asked us, you know, Memorial University, to work on a project for a number of their senior civil servants around kind of project management assessments, that sort of area. And this is not, I'm never going to put this in writing, but we were really pushed in terms of our thinking. And we were pushed in our thinking by this amazing senior Jamaican civil servant who had a PhD in education. And she was a very, very strong Afro-Caribbean woman who had very, very strong opinions and would put us through the grinder every time we met with her. But she was always prompting us to say, well, how does this lead to reflection in terms of the content that we're developing and our learning objectives and our learning frameworks? How does this lead to them, to the people who are doing the course and going through this content, them coming out with better outcomes? And that really prompted me when I came back from sabbatical in early 2020 to really start to take a look at the notion of reflection, because that's what she kept on pushing us on. And when you start to look at the academic literature around reflection, especially from a teaching and learning perspective, this is something that's gaining increasingly attention in both the theory, practice, and education, especially in social and behavioral sciences. So it's in other ways of reflecting back, what are we actually learning, and getting students to reflect back in terms of what they're actually learning. One second. So reflection and related notions such as reflective practice, reflexivity, critical reflection, and critical thinking gain increasingly importance across a diversity of academic disciplines. They've always been there. When I did my PhD in the early 1990s, well, actually middle 1990s, critical management, for example, we would be applying kind of philosophical concepts to the notion of management. That had been around since the 1980s. If you look at disciplines like philosophy, sociology, anthropology, this notion of reflective practice, reflexivity, critical reflection is not new. What I think where it has been new is the diversity in terms of how we approach it and how we learn, how we utilize that in a teaching and learning environment. And moreover, from a practice standpoint, and especially in the professional schools where I come from, is that reflection is generally regarded as being very valuable for professional practice and lifelong learning. The notion of learning logs, the notion of taking a step back and thinking about, okay, what have I learned? What am I doing? Where am I going? And this is something that if you're in the management world and you're being coached, or you're trying to reflect on what do I need to do to advance my career or advance myself, then the reflection becomes an incredibly important part of that in terms of saying, what have I done? Where am I going? Kind of both strategically and both tactically. And this notion of reflection being incredibly valuable has been adopted, as we've seen, in higher education training and accreditation standards, especially in the UK and internationally. And so it's more, once again, kind of thinking through, and as Ed said in the comments, in the Bachelor of Education, so important. And this is, once again, one of those, it's an amazing tool when you start to kind of push students along those ways, not push or encourage students, shall we say, to get them to start to think about reflection. And when we look at the notion of where reflection can come in, it can come into almost all the different elements of when we look at the learning pyramid, and this comes from the National Training Laboratories from the United States in Maine, where they talked about average student retention rates going anywhere from 10% to reading to 90% teaching others, but there can be elements of reflection in reading, audiovisual, demonstration, discussion, practice, and teaching others. So the reason I put this learning pyramid up is that, so this is where part of the study is where I was going back to full-time teaching in spring 2020. And as we all know, there was a pandemic, and up to that point, I had taught one remote course back in probably 8-9 years before last year. And it had no elements. It was just kind of your typical asynchronous course. Here's some content. There was some discussion forums, but here's some case studies, here's some lecture notes, here's some assignments, off you go. And I'm having to develop, and I was teaching 3 MBA courses, which I'll get into in a sec, but I was trying to figure out, okay, well, what am I going to do? How are we going to learn? I'm more traditionally, if you look at a lot of my other courses, I'm more discussion based or practice doing in terms of my learning pyramids and what I kind of focus on in the classroom and the way that I engage with students. But I was kind of going, okay, what am I going to do? And I was really struck. And so I went back to Bloom's taxonomy, and I said, okay, well, from when I'm developing my learning objectives and almost kind of developing the courses from scratch, how do I take what I was getting schooled on in Jamaica on reflection and the importance of reflection, and how do I start to bring that in to my courses? And how do I start to think about that notion of reflection. And really, when we look at Bloom's taxonomy and within the domains, there's an element of evaluation and comprehension that probably comes, or that I saw that came from reflection in terms of, especially in a business and management world, in terms of critiquing, criticizing, appraising, assessing. We do a lot of that already in the case studies that we're doing. And if you're using case studies or in the examples that we're using in class, and moreover, good managers and good professionals are going through this kind of evaluation. While elements of management thinking and management school do have an element of comprehension, especially if you're looking at accounting and finance, etc. The evaluation, which is in a lot of the courses that I was teaching, like entrepreneurship, strategy, etc., was probably even more important. So I'm kind of trying to think to myself, how do I start to evaluate? How do I start to bring in better reflective elements in terms of the courses that I was trying to develop? So up to this point, as I mentioned before, I knew of TED Talks. The one TED Talk I use consistently in my classes, and probably since early kind of, I'd say about 2004, 2003, had been the amazing talk by Ray Anderson about the business logic of sustainability. And two of the courses I teach at in the Faculty of Business Administration are on business and society, which is basically looking at kind of business ethics, corporate social responsibility, business sustainability, and how that all kind of interplays, as well as managing ethics and responsibility, which is kind of the MBA version of that. And Ray Anderson, if you don't know of him, and he's unfortunately deceased now, but he was the CEO of Interflora. And where I first heard of him was in the amazing Canadian documentary, The Corporation, which is kind of a critical reflection, actually very, very critical reflection on the role of corporations in society, et cetera. And it's one of those things that as Canadian business school professors, we can show in class and say, what do you guys think? But probably not something you show in the United States, to be honest, because they probably be really critical, especially in the business school. But I used the movie The Corporation at the beginning of my career academic career back in 2006, 2007, as a jumping off point, because it was a very, very critical point. And so, well, where do we see the gaps? What do we agree with? What do we not agree with? The problem with movies is that they're about 2 hours, right? 2.5 hours. And if you're going to take up a whole class of 2.5 hours watching a movie, and not every student had access to that movie either, because they would have to go buy it. I would have to show it in class. We had the license to use it. But it wasn't the ideal discussion forum, because even if you showed it all in class, or you showed parts of it, you were missing parts. And Ray Anderson was interviewed in that, and in that documentary, and he was very powerful. This is a guy who made a lot of money, and he talked about how he changed his whole, or how as a leader of the company that he was the owner for and was a major manufacturer of carpet, how they retransformed the business along sustainability lines, focusing on water, chemical usage, etc. And when I found him talking at TED, I was able to, this is great, because he's only talking for 20 minutes. This is ideal. And secondly, instead of having to watch a 2.5 hour video, which I still encourage students to watch on their own time, if they could get it, I could make sure that we had a standard approach in terms of those 20 minutes. So I was using that for a while, and then back in the fall of 2018, I was teaching a course for our MBAs and our Masters of Science students in management, and I was using them. I was using a couple more TED Talks, just kind of a starter point for discussion in class. It was very much kind of a seminar, and I was just kind of trying it out, and I got pretty good feedback. Not enormously good feedback, but they were kind of discussion points. And they were including ones on kind of risk, behavioral economics, etc. The great thing for me as an instructor is that all the TED Talks are free. There's no advertising, and they're all online. So it's not like a YouTube video where there's going to be in the middle of it, you're going to get an ad from Procter and Gamble or something like that. There's going to be, when you start showing them, you can do it from there. And they were a good way, class is boring sometimes, like there's only so long that people want to listen to me. So 20 minutes of having somebody else and saying, what did this mean, was kind of a great jumping off point from a discussion-based course. So spring 2020, March, the pandemic hits. I was down for teaching 3 courses. There was all the amazing guidance and approaches that we've gotten from CITLs since that time were not in place. And I was kind of going, okay, I got to go back well and figure out, first of all, like, and I've been using D2L, I've been putting content on and everything, but I hadn't been using them really as I use kind of online or Brightspace as a way of putting my notes on. So, but there was no recorded lectures or anything like that. And moreover, I said, okay, well, and I've kind of done a couple of executive training courses where I'd been online and done like 6 hours or 7 hours or 3.5 hours. And if you've done that, you know that people's retention rates go dramatically. And then secondly, it's brutal. The longer it goes, the more brutal it gets, as we can see from having to listen to me for an hour this morning. So what I decided to do is say, well, how do I start to incorporate the TED Talks as a way of, instead of me, like I would show them in class, well, maybe if I'm not going to show them in class, maybe I can direct students to actually watch them, and then they can do kind of reflective learning in terms of what you're trying to do. So I used them in the spring for 3 courses, which included Business 8107, which was Managing Ethics and Responsibility, Business 8208, which was MBA Strategy, and then Business 9034, which is MBA Strategic Risk Management. Some of these I hadn't taught in a while. Strategy I hadn't taught in almost 13 years up at that point. And my typical numbers were reasonably low, 35, 20, and 35, 20, and 20, as you can see from this chart. But what we found, especially in the faculty business administration, our numbers went up quite significantly in the spring, and then even more so in the fall. Some of these were delivered in different ways, like the usual 12 weeks, and the strategic risk management was actually delivered over 4 Saturdays, which was the intention before the pandemic. Only one of them actually used a textbook, which was Business 8107, and the rest were all blended. Every one of them had a weekly TED Talk that the students were asked to review and assess, etc. So, for example, this is kind of the typical outline for what I did for the first couple of weeks in 1600, which is kind of an introduction to entrepreneurship. So I would have a week in kind of a subject area, then there'd be kind of a short case. We've been using cases in business for 50, 60 years. It's an unusual approach. And then I would have kind of a short article related to the subject, normally from somewhere like the Harvard Business Review, et cetera. And then I had TED Talks. And then so I started off like with entrepreneurship. Let's raise kids to be entrepreneurs. And then secondly, maybe a little bit more critical, well, they don't tell you about entrepreneurship, which is kind of the emotional element from there. And then probably one of the most successful, kind of more rock star entrepreneurs that we have these days, Elon Musk, talking about the future we are building and boring. And some kind of more kind of standard ones after that, like the single biggest reason why startups succeed and 5 ways to lead in an area of constant change. These were all TED Talks every week. And I thought, worst case scenario, the students will look at them and they'll think about them, and that's it. Along the way, I was trying to say, well, okay, let's go back. How do we do this reflective thinking? How do we actually engage in this reflective thinking? One of the things we had used in entrepreneurship, and my colleague Blair Windsor kind of developed these, is learning logs. And I taught entrepreneurship before, and to be honest, the learning logs were a pain in my butt because it was more about what did you specifically learn about X, Y, and Z. And I decided, well, let's take this up a level. Let's just talk about what, instead of doing one every week, let's do one every three to 4 weeks. And I asked the students, in questions. I said, what did you learn from this section the previous 4 weeks of the course? What do you want to learn from the next section of the course? And what are some of the business ideas around entrepreneurship you would like to pursue or learn about? So that was kind of, and I did that for all the different courses that I was engaged in. So this was once again trying to get that reflective learning. What did you learn? What do you want to learn? And what are some of the business ideas you can pursue or learn about? So you could take out the word entrepreneurship and put in strategy or risk management. I also asked the question, what do you see from the course that you can be applied to the practice of management in your career? Which is once again kind of more the is once again that kind of critical reflection. I also had, from a reflection standpoint, a bunch of discussion forums, which I'd never used up to that point on Brightspace D2L. Actually, to be fair, I did use them in my online course that I had taught 6-7 years before. It was a disaster. They didn't work really well. And I had online participation where I would put in a question about the case study, a question about the slides, or discussion question about the case study, a discussion question about the slides, a discussion question about the articles, and a discussion question about the TED Talks. And also, when I brought in some guest speakers, I also had kind of discussion question from there as well. This was worth 10% of their marks, so not a huge amount. And as the learning logs were worth another 15. And I gave, and once again, the TED Talks were pretty varied. And for the strategy ones, like Martin Reeves, who is a thinker from Boston Consulting Group, talked about your strategy needs a strategy. Probably the biggest one of these that's been seen, I think something like 9-10 million times, is John Doerr, why the secret to success is setting the right goals. But these, once again, would be some of the examples that I kind of showed from there. So what did I find? And this was really cool. I had no idea. Literally, I was thinking from a practical standpoint, this is 20 minutes that they don't have to listen to me, because I had recorded lectures and I had, weekly Q&A sessions and summary lectures and all that sort of thing. And so this is actual student quotes that I got back from the discussion. Most of this I took from their final learning logs, but this is indicative of what I got on a weekly basis. So, there's from the undergraduates, here's some of the student feedback, and I'll just read these out. I know you can read them, but we're at 11:46, so we got time. The TED Talks and articles that we read through the semester were related to entrepreneurship, while at the same time were generally very informative and can be applied to subjects unrelated to entrepreneurship, such as the unexpected benefit of celebrating failure, the TED Talk from week 7. Once again, you're probably thinking, who are these students? So these are kind of first or second year university undergraduate students. These are not MBA students or not graduate students. And so I thought that quote was really, once again, kind of applying once again the reflective in terms of how do we apply to entrepreneurship to subjects that were unrelated, which is one of the things I was trying to get to, because when you're going through ideas, how sometimes things are unrelated from there. Another student said, I learned that I really enjoyed listening to those TED Talks, so thank you for that. A couple of students since the course ended have continued on listening to TED Talks and finding them from there. My overall favorite of the part of the course, this is a third quote, were the TED Talks that were informational and interesting. I got to learn what personality traits it takes to become an entrepreneur and what separates them from the people who work for them, which was one of my biggest questions before we started this course. Once again, very, very positive. Some other feedback. The TED Talks really educated me on the mental state of entrepreneurs and how it's important to take care of yourself as it is for your career, which was one of the first talks that I had the students listen to, but it was a continual theme that we had with entrepreneurship, and they came back to that. And this, when I look at the discussion forums, this was a really big theme that emerged, and it was kind of prompted by the TED Talk. Which summarizes one of the key learning points for me from this course from using TED Talks, is that I've learned many things from this course. There's a TED Talk for just about anything, which is very, very true. Another student wrote, the TED Talks are great for getting a different perspective on various topics, which is so true. When you think about it, we usually have the professor and then we're reflecting on what she or he or they say. And then suddenly you bring in somebody different to take a look at what they're talking about. Another student said, one TED Talk on leadership was particularly of great interest to me. The speaker noted that great leaders do not perform on the stage, but set it for others to perform on it. This has led me to think about leadership and what power should look like in any organization as well. Really profound, really reflective thinking for what is a second year business student, which predominantly, to be fair, that kind of reflection is maybe something that only comes maybe later in their university career. A couple more quotes from the undergraduate students. I've come to enjoy the TED Talks that show the aspirations and experiences of others who have tried, sometimes failed, and succeeded through the professional career. Another one, all the TED Talks and articles portrayed the lifestyles of famous entrepreneurs and their lifestyles and how they became successful over time. Life is not easy and there will be obstacles, but how you handle those struggles will determine the type of entrepreneur that you are. And then final one, I found that the TED Talks and guest speakers were a great learning experience for this course. I thoroughly enjoyed the material in the course as well. Now you're probably saying, well, Tom, this is positive attribution bias, etc. But this is pretty consistent. This is, I would say, out of 175 students, I would say was overwhelmingly, probably 95%. We're talking about, and they were allowed to feedback and do their learning logs and everything. They focused on the TED Talks and they thought, and some of them did the articles, but they were very, very into from there as well. Sorry, a couple more quotes. I've learned that the failure has the potential through the TED Talks to lead entrepreneurs to the greatest amount of success, which is another key thing that we're trying to get them to reflect on, about how it's not always just being the most successful, but it's also being about the people who fail and learn from that. The things I liked most about this course were the weekly TED Talks, as I think they helped me understand an entrepreneur's perspective on things. And the material was very interesting, and the TED Talks are a great addition to the course. So this, and then the final one, I'm hoping this is the final one, sorry. When watching the TED Talk about the importance of a business startup is time, and that truly took me off guard when thinking that finance or an idea may be more important. Once I have watched this video, maybe rethink the business startup process and understanding as to why time can be the most important. This also linked to my final assignment, as the timing for my business idea is based off the current pandemic we are in. The timing for this business idea to start up would be now while the pandemic is still ongoing. So for me, that was a brilliant learning reflection, which the notion of time, and timing's everything, as we like to say in business, but taking that TED Talk and then applying, kind of reflecting back and saying, actually, it isn't the content or the money that you have or the idea that you have. It's also about the timing and making sure that that's appropriate. And then taking that learning that the student had and reflecting that in one of their major projects they had to do for the course, which was the business idea and how they would start that up. And then ultimately showing why success or unsuccessful a concept or a business may be, regardless of the resources, regardless of the people that you have involved in, because the notion of time, to me was phenomenal. And once again, totally unexpected. I literally, when I started this, I just thought, okay, great. Once again, 20 minutes that they can have where they don't have to listen to me, etc. The other cool thing that emerged from a reflection standpoint is the difference between the undergraduates and the graduates. So I would kind of classify this, and I'm not, I don't have my PhD in education, it's in business, but I would say that was more reflective learning. So from the undergraduates, the critical reflection that was coming from the graduate, the MBA students, was phenomenal as well, and how they use the TED Talks as kind of a starting point to analyze issues and cases in business. Let me just take one. This was from a TED Talk about why sneakers are a great investment. And these are a bunch of 4 or 5 students in their discussion forums talking through this particular case, this particular TED Talk. So they write, the main issues are the unregulated markets of sneaker sales, but this can relate to any collectible that can gain in value. The speaker promotes a centralized system for trading and leveraging sneakers and related investment vehicles. I think the key aspect is market segmentation, but leveraging this brand awareness to a system level marketing strategy. By doing limited releases instead of mass rollouts, Nike creates demand that pushes its whole product line. And then the students go back and forth. I agree that the main issue is the unregulated sneaker market, and I think that the portion of the market that it's similar to the unregulated drug market is even the biggest concern. And then you saw another student go in and say, I'll just for the purposes of time, bringing in some of the theories that we discussed in the course, like Porter's 5 forces, and talking about how the competitive market was able to use, and the final paragraph saying some of the main issues I saw in this talk stemming from what you and that was the student's name, said is that of the unregulated sneaker market, Nike's strategy with respect to this, as well as the astronomical value of it all, linking them together, I think a huge ethical concern could arise. Granted, collectible markets existed for a long time, but this one functions differently at a much larger scale. The critical reflection that I got from the graduate students was phenomenal, using these TED Talks as basically as a discussion forum as well. So the key learning points for me is that undergraduate and graduate students use reflection in different ways. And maybe I didn't know, and at least in the business world, sometimes they use the same TED Talk, and how they reflected was interesting from kind of they saw it in different ways. I think the other thing is that these were great tools. Reflective practice, reflexivity, critical reflection, and critical thinking can be applied to TED Talks, and actually quite well. The applies to also a bunch of different learning preferences. There's visual. You can see these people talking. I've used podcasts in the past as experiments. They didn't work as well, but these worked well. Auditory, reading, writing. Once again, that's there was lots of really interesting. I think it once again applies to lots of different learning preferences. And then finally, that there is a TED Talk for everything. And the great thing is just you just put in a quick Boolean search and say, I'm looking for something on success, or I'm looking on something on failure. And you can, or if I'm looking for this type of approach, there is a TED Talk for pretty much everything. I think the key learning points for me the key pointing points for others is that there's a gap in the academic literature in respect to how TED Talks can be used. If we just kind of focus on the English as a second language and the comprehension element, I think it's very powerful because you have people with different accents, people speaking fast, people speaking slow. But I think there's a gap in terms of looking at how TED Talks could be further explored as a teaching and learning tool in respect to research, practice, and learning implications as well. The other key thing is this is an ideal source of content in an online environment. Most, if not all, the disciplines can use them. If I'm going to get a case study from the Harvard Business School Publishing, which is awesome, and I use those case studies, they're going to cost me about $6 each American, between $5 and $6 American. And we do have some free case studies within the library, but for the most part, they're relatively dated. TED Talks, on the other hand, are free. And I know that we have relatively low tuition at Memorial, but I'm always trying to think about, okay, well, how do I get free content into the hands of my students? And ideally something that's robust, that they don't have to go looking for, that I can give them a link and they can go off from there as well. I think the other key learning point for me from a research standpoint is that, in the scholarship of teaching and learning, is that there's an interesting research question on the age implications for critical reflection in terms of how students see TED Talks. I think a longitudinally reflection approaches change. And I'm not sure how that, once again, I'm not a scholar in the educational literature, but I could see it in terms of the undergraduates versus the MBA students looking at the TED Talks in much different ways and how they applied their learning, their content to the process of analyzing and reflecting upon these TED Talks. It also caters, for anybody who's a teacher or is interested in teaching and learning. One of the key things that I've seen in the last 12, 13 years is that attention spans have gone down. Once upon a time, you could get students to be paying attention to you for a good 40, 45 minutes. And ultimately, good luck. It just doesn't occur anymore. You can get, I find 20, 25 minutes is kind of golden. And it's difficult sometimes, and it's not your top students, it's more kind of the your average middle, kind of lower middle, who suddenly start to lose attention. 18-minute talks is kind of perfect for them to go in, they can pay attention to it, they can take some notes, and then they can do it from there. Anecdotally, I know a couple of the parents that I was listening to, or that I know, sorry, I know the parents of some of my students in entrepreneurship, and anecdotally they came to me unsolicited and said, I'm listening to these talks that are going on from doing things from there. Uh, and it's interesting to see how they're all listening to these TED Talks. Ed asked the question, yeah, I do give them a body brain break, and I do that for almost all. But this is once again in a remote environment where you want them to take that break. But in the classroom, yeah, I would have them kind of listen to for about 20, 25 minutes as well. There's limitations though. I think for those people who have, these are aimed at a wider audience, and they're limited what I would say hardcore academic content. Some of them have, really good statistics, but they're relatively descriptive. The content, they may not be doing lots of references to Habermas or to, to other kind of academic sources. And so they're really good as a starting point, but they're not the end, especially in a university-based environment. I think the assessment possibilities are somewhat limited. I wouldn't want to be doing multiple choice tests or comprehension tests around TED Talks. I think they work much better kind of from a reflective standpoint. But if you're going to use these and say, I'm going to test you on these TED Talks, I'm not sure that would be as powerful as what I've tried to use them, accidentally as a reflective mechanism as well. There's so many TED Talks, and there's a tendency to overlook all the talks. One of the unfortunate instances of, especially when you're under pressure to get, to figure out who these are, you go with the ones which are most seen. And so there may be a tendency to overlook some which may be very, very applicable, or they may have some really, really good points, but they may not have the best or the coolest speaker, etc. So there's a tendency to focus on the most popular ones. It may have been my selection, but some people may say, well, Tom, you chose a lot of older white guys. And I'm always conscious of diversity issues these days. And maybe that's just my inherent bias, which I'm trying to work on all the time. But there is some diversity, and I think it's maybe that's just me, but there's a tendency, the most popular ones are not as diverse. I also think, given a place like Memorial with its mission and the amazing local people that we have who are experts, there's a limitation on local content. There isn't maybe as much about Newfoundland and Labrador. And so what I did to mitigate that, especially for my undergraduate course, is that I brought in guest speakers locally. But the great thing about guest speakers is that they're more synchronous. The students can ask questions, they can engage with them rather than the asynchronous approach of the TED Talks. And that's about it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and for the organizers of the Teaching Learning Conference. I think it's my third time being here. I think I'm 3 out of 3, or maybe only 2 out of 3, I don't know. But Claire, I'm very happy to answer any questions or have a discussion. These just work for me. And so I don't want to be evangelical, but I am being kind of evangelical, saying these are great tools. You haven't really thought about them in your teaching and learning so far. I highly recommend them. Thank you.
For sure. So if anyone has any questions, you can send them through the public chat or you can send me a private chat. I haven't gotten anything yet, but I have a question. What would you consider to be your favorite TED Talk?
I'm still the Ray Anderson one about the business logic of sustainability is very, very powerful. It's very inspirational, and it kind of got me started. So that would probably be the one that I really, really like. And he's of this kind of older Southern gentleman. He died maybe a year after giving the talk, and it really struck me like how devoted he was to this subject, and so that's probably my favorite one. My students also really, really like the Malcolm Gladwell ones. They were very a lot of them had never experienced Malcolm Gladwell before, and so he doesn't have a huge number of them. I think he may have one, maybe two. But his one is on spaghetti sauce, I think, or something like that. But the Malcolm Gladwell, I like Malcolm Gladwell, but yeah, that would be kind of my second favorite ones.
Nice, yeah, that's awesome. I was at a TEDx event in St. John's a few years ago and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah, no, they're great events, and they're great. And I think Claire, it's especially in the remote environment, and so especially given the pandemic, when we're trying to give students content that they're not all just reading the screen and stuff like that. And this was for me kind of a content source that I'd use, but I hadn't really reflected on, and more of I hadn't had students reflect on how what they could use with them or not use with them. And so it was really, really good from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few questions coming in.
Okay.
Our first question is, can TED Talk links be posted in the Brightspace shells? Does
Yes.
copyright have to be considered?
No, they it opens up into a separate box, and I think it's fair use copyright, so they're not. It's all free and access from there as well.
Perfect.
With everything with copyright, it's always good to kind of double check it from there. What
Mhm.
I do is I go to the library and they kind of do it all for me, and so then you kind of have that little widget at the end, and then they have the kind of links, and then they
Right.
do it from there.
Kind of like the external tool, I guess.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And so, but it opens up in an external, just, a kind of external box from there. I don't see any, I think it's fair and free use, but, you know, if I'm wrong, I'm really sorry, but I will continue to use those and I'll ask for copyright. But, it's, it's owned by a not-for-profit organization. And, it's once again, it's available from there. Um, and do you want me to answer Ed's question, Claire? Or are there more questions?
We just had one more come in that was sent to me privately. So the question is, are you aware of any literature on the effectiveness of TED Talks on student learning outcomes or motivation?
Yeah, in the presentation, there was one kind of slide which I didn't get to, which was references. And I did review as part of this talk some of the academic literature. I didn't see specifically anything on student motivation, but it's a really, really interesting kind of question. As I mentioned before, most of the talk, the literature was around using TED Talks for reading and learning or listening comprehension, not reading comprehension, but listening comprehension, rather than how that can be motivated. But it was a great research question, especially in one of the fields that I do work on is entrepreneurship. Like, as in, can you inspire more students to become entrepreneurs by listening to those kind of TED Talks? That would be great, or to inspire people in from science, all those sort of things as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Ed asked a question, Tom, have you had students view the TED Talk and have a group discussion afterwards? Yeah. So in the remote environment, Ted, that's what they do. They have big weekly, there's a TED Talk, and then there's a discussion forum in Brightspace where they get to discuss specifically that TED Talk. That was out of the 4 or 5 discussion questions that I had every week. The TED Talks by far were the most popular. Um, in in a pre-pandemic, as I mentioned, I did have we'd always talked through the we talked through like Ray Anderson's The Business Logic of Sustainability, but that kind of that course I mentioned where we were organizational theory, which was for higher level MBA students, Masters of Science and Management students, so research-based students. Yes, we would use the TED Talk as a discussion around what are the theoretical implications around what the speakers were saying and trying to apply, you know, dynamic capability theory or institutional theory or stakeholder theory or even some of the ethical theories in terms of how they were applying from there. They were really good discussion starting off point, and you'd almost want them to have them prepared, and it was better than me speaking to them, to be fair, because I'm people get bored listening to me after a while.
We just had a comment come in from the person that asked the question about copyright. She just says, thank you for this interesting topic. I agree there's a wealth of material to draw from. The beauty is that TED Talks are in different languages, so they are very useful for second language learning and, as you say, ESL students.
Yeah, and I didn't realize until I was preparing for this talk the number of talks, for example, that were in Hindi.
Mm.
Which was there's a phenomenal database around Hindi and other things as well, and so it's I'm always looking for great sources of content to bring in to help students in the process of learning. And I think TED Talks provide that. they're a great source of content. Um, as really kind of a discussion, and moreover, trying to get people to come and be guest speakers in your course. Like a lot of these people are world experts, and you're not going to get them to come into your course because their schedules are all over the place. And so you can get them to do something. You can get them to listen to somebody who's really, really keen, and someone who's really, really an expert, or someone who's really, really famous, and have them come speak. And it was a nice, powerful tool, especially once again when we come back to that kind of reflective learning element.
Yes, for sure. So I didn't get any other questions come in, but we still have 5 minutes, so we'll give it another minute or two before I conclude. So if you have, oh, we just had one come in. Can you say again how you characterize the reflection by undergrads versus grad students? What is the difference in the quality of their reflections?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would characterize if I go, the the MBA ones were very more focused on critical thinking, and I think the undergraduates was more reflective, critical reflection or reflection practice. The and so there's a small distinction there, but if I look at the notion of how the MBA students and the MSc students were bringing in concepts and theories into the discussion, rather than necessarily kind of the broader elements of what does this mean in practice, I think that's where the undergraduates, I think we're really kind of focusing on what does this mean for me, and how does this reflect on my own personal learning. The MBAs were probably less concerned about that. It was more like, okay, let's tear this apart and see how this fits in terms of concept or what they're saying, etc. So one was more critical, the other one was more kind of the broader kind of reflective elements as well.
Perfect. Yeah, that's super interesting. So, I guess we can clue up here. So, I just wanted to thank you all for joining this session.